There are places in the deep South where the heat doesn't just make you sweat. It makes you forget who you were before you arrived. Towns so small they don't appear on GPS, where everyone knows the rules, but nobody will tell you what they are. Where the kudzu grows in patterns that spell out names of the missing. Where dinner bells ring at the exact moment something walks down Main Street checking windows. Where the humidity itself learns to breathe with your lungs. Welcome to Verified Fears. Tonight, we're diving into 11 stories from southern small towns that understand a simple truth. The worst horrors don't announce themselves with screams. They arrive quietly, in the amber sap bleeding from severed vines, in the identical mannerisms of the baptized, in the sawdust that remembers every man who died grinding it. These are the stories that locals won't talk about, the ones buried under decades of silence and sweet tea politeness, the ones that prove sometimes the scariest thing about a place isn't what happened there. It's what's still happening, waiting for the next outsider who doesn't know the rules. I used to think kudzu was just an invasive plant, an annoyance, something that swallowed up abandoned buildings and forgotten property lines across the South. I was a property inspector in Elmore County, Alabama, and I'd seen kudzu consume everything from old barns to entire mobile homes. But I'd never seen it do what it did at the house on Meriwether Road. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. County records showed an antebellum home that hadn't been inspected in 43 years. The owner had died, distant relatives were trying to sell, and I needed to assess the structure before it could go on the market. Simple job. I'd done hundreds like it. The GPS took me down progressively narrower roads until I was on what was barely more than a dirt path. And then I saw it through the trees. At first, I thought I was looking at a hill covered in kudzu. But as I got closer, I realized it was the house. The vines had completely consumed it, wrapped around every surface, crawled through every opening, created a shell of green that pulsed slightly in the breeze like something breathing. I've seen kudzu-covered structures before. But this was different. The vines weren't just growing randomly, they were forming patterns, shapes. And as I walked closer, my boots crunching on the gravel driveway, I realized what I was looking at. Names. The kudzu had grown to spell out names across the front of the house. Dozens of them, maybe more, twisted into the vines like someone had carefully trained them. Sarah Dietrich, Marcus Webb, Jennifer Oakes. I recognized some of them. Missing persons cases from over the years. Cold cases that had gone nowhere. People who'd vanished from towns nearby with no explanation, no bodies, nothing. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to call my supervisor. But there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. I was in the middle of nowhere, staring at what looked like a memorial made of living vines, and every professional instinct I had was screaming at me to leave. But I had a job to do. And besides, I told myself, there had to be a rational explanation. Someone had planted these vines intentionally. Some kind of sick memorial or art project. I pulled my machete from the truck. Standard equipment for inspecting overgrown properties. The blade was sharp, and I'd used it 1,000 times to clear paths and doorways. I approached the front entrance, or where the front entrance should have been, and started cutting. And the moment the blade sliced through the first vine, I knew something was wrong. The vine didn't just break, it bled. Thick, amber sap oozed from the cut, and the smell hit me immediately. Funeral flowers. Specifically, the lilies they bank around caskets at Southern funerals. That cloying, sweet smell that sticks in your throat and makes your eyes water. It poured from the vine like blood from an artery. I should have stopped. I should have dropped the machete and run back to my truck. But I'd already started, and there was something almost hypnotic about the way the sap caught the sunlight, golden and viscous. I kept cutting. Each vine released more of that amber fluid, and soon my boots were sticky with it. The smell so overwhelming I could taste it. It took 20 minutes to cut through enough vines to expose what had been the front door. The wood was intact underneath, preserved somehow, as if the kudzu had been protecting it rather than destroying it. I pushed it open, and the hinges screamed. The interior was dark. Whatever light might have come through the windows was blocked by the dense layer of kudzu outside. I clicked on my flashlight and stepped inside, and that's when I saw the camera. It was sitting on the floor in the foyer, a professional camcorder, the kind property inspectors used for documentation. There was a strip of masking tape on the side with a name written in marker. David Reeves, the inspector who'd been sent here before me, the one who'd never filed his report, the one who'd been missing for 6 weeks. The camera's record light was still on, still recording. My mouth went dry. The battery should have died weeks ago. But the light was steady, and when I picked up the camera and looked at the viewfinder, I saw footage. Hours and hours of footage. The timestamps showing it had been recording continuously since the day he'd arrived. I hit rewind, watching the frames blur backward. And then I pressed play. The footage showed his arrival, similar to mine. The house covered in kudzu, the same patterns spelling out names. But there were fewer names then. I counted them in the footage, 17. Now there were at least 30 on the exterior. The vines had been busy. I watched him cut through the kudzu, watched the amber sap flow, watched him enter the house just as I had. The footage showed him walking through the rooms with his flashlight, documenting everything. The video was steady, professional. He was doing his job, just like me. But then his footsteps started echoing strangely. Not the simple echo of an empty house, something else. Like his footsteps were being repeated in rooms he hadn't entered yet. He noticed it too. The camera swung around, and I could hear his breathing pick up. That's when the house started changing. I watched the doorway behind him shift on the footage. Not dramatically, just slightly. As if the frame had stretched a few inches, as if the hallway had grown longer while he wasn't looking. He turned back around, kept walking. But the rooms weren't the same anymore. He passed a parlor I'd seen on the initial footage. But now there was a second parlor beyond it. Identical, but subtly wrong. The furniture was positioned as a mirror image. The portrait above the mantel showed the same woman, but she was facing the opposite direction. He started moving faster. The camera footage showed him trying to retrace his steps, but the house wasn't letting him. Rooms multiplied, hallways extended. He'd passed through a doorway, only to find himself in a version of a room he'd already documented, but different. Wrong. The kudzu had started growing inside too, I realized. Thin vines creeping across the ceiling, down the walls, spelling out more names. Fresh names. Names that wouldn't show up on missing persons reports for weeks, including his own. The footage showed his growing panic. He ran. The camera bounced wildly as he sprinted through rooms that shouldn't exist, down hallways that twisted in ways that defied the external dimensions of the house. And all around him, the kudzu grew. Fast, impossibly fast. Not the slow creep of normal vine growth, but rapid, purposeful, like fingers reaching. I could hear him screaming on the recording, begging, and then the footage stabilized as he stopped running. He'd set the camera down, positioned it carefully on what looked like a mantel. His face appeared in frame as he stared directly into the lens. His eyes were wide, and there were vine tendrils growing from his collar, thin green shoots that disappeared under his shirt. "It's not covering the house," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's digesting it, one room at a time. And it's not just the house anymore." His hand came up to his neck, touched the vines there, and I saw them pulse. They were growing from him, or into him, I couldn't tell which. "If you're watching this," he said, "you're already inside. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But you need to understand. It doesn't kill you. It takes your rooms, the rooms in your memory, the places you've been. It adds them to itself. It's growing a geography of everywhere we've ever been, and it won't let us leave until it has every room we've ever walked through." The footage showed him looking around, and I realized with creeping horror that the room he was in wasn't part of the original house anymore. It was a room I recognized. My childhood bedroom, down to the scratch on the closet door, the water stain on the ceiling. The house had already been inside my memories, extracting them, building them into its impossible interior. The recording continued for hours after that, showing him sitting there as the vines slowly covered him, and behind him, through doorways that shouldn't exist, I could see other rooms. My grandmother's kitchen, my first apartment, the office where I'd gotten my inspector's license. The house was building me into itself, room by room, memory by memory. I dropped the camera. That was 15 minutes ago. I've been trying to find the front door ever since, but every doorway leads to another room from my past. I just walked through my high school cafeteria. Before that, the hospital room where my father died. The kudzu is inside now, growing across the ceiling, down the walls. And it's spelling out a name I haven't seen yet. Mine. The vines are reaching for me as I record this on my phone. They smell like funeral flowers, and they're whispering with voices I recognize. All the people whose names were written on the outside. They're still here, I think. Part of the house now, part of the kudzu. And I can feel it starting. That pull toward every room I've ever known, every place I've ever been. The house is hungry for those memories, and it's going to take its time digesting every single one. I can see my front door now, the one from my current apartment. It's growing out of the wall in front of me. Kudzu vines forming the frame, the doorknob. If I open it, I wonder if I'll find my living room, or just another version of it, another memory for the house to consume. The vines are touching my ankles now. They're warm, they're patient. And I'm starting to forget which rooms are real and which ones are just places I used to know. I was stranded in a town that didn't want me there. I never intended to stay more than a night. Just a quick stopover in an old Georgia mill town, the sort of place you pass on a forgotten highway and wonder how people live so quietly. My car broke down on the edge of town, right when sunset started pouring gold across the roads. Nothing felt wrong yet, not until I heard the bells. Every house had a dinner bell hanging outside, some crusted with rust, some so old the brackets looked like they might snap. But at exactly 6:47 p.m., 17 minutes before the sun dipped past the trees, every bell in town rang as one. The sound bounced through empty streets and drifted over the river, echoing like a warning. I watched from my motel window, uncertain and tense, until the noise stopped as abruptly as it started. Everyone disappeared inside. Every window and door was shut. The first night, I chalked it up to some local tradition, The town was old. The streets were lined with dusty brick buildings that hadn't changed in 50 years. It felt like stepping back in time, and that thought alone was enough to keep my nerves pricked. That evening, the motel manager left a covered dish at my door with a note. "Be indoors before the bell." No explanation. Just those 5 words scrawled in tight handwriting, and a casserole I couldn't bring myself to touch. I tried to get my car fixed the next morning, but the only mechanic in town told me he was booked until Thursday. It was Monday. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He told me I could look around if I wanted, just not after sundown. He said it like I should have already understood. With nothing to do, I walked the length of Main Street. People nodded, but they didn't smile. Their eyes darted to the sky like they were counting down the hours. I ducked into the diner, and the waitress barely spoke when she set a plate in front of me. The radio above the counter kept static company, only ever interrupted by local news and the exact same song every hour on the hour. A calendar framed on the wall was stuck on the same month and year, July 1953. My room at the motel was cold, and the little television barely picked up channels. As sunset crept closer, my curiosity soured into dread. I kept glancing at the clock. The air outside thickened. The bugs went silent. And exactly at 6:47 p.m., the bells rang again. Every light in every window flickered on. Curtains snapped shut so fast it felt rehearsed. I stood right at the door, heart thundering. For a minute, I swore I heard something moving down the pavement outside, a long, scraping stride like boots on old asphalt. I told myself it was my imagination, that the quiet was just country stillness, nothing more. But I pressed myself against the wall until the last echoes died and the world felt normal again. On the third night, restlessness won out over fear. The bells rang at 6:47 p.m., but this time I cracked a curtain and looked. The street was empty, but in the yellow haze of the fading sun, a shadow taller than a man drifted through the intersection. It was gaunt, impossibly long, its bones visible even from 50 yards away. It stopped in front of each house, turning its head as if it was counting windows. My breath caught. I was sure it would sense me. It moved with that deliberate stillness, the kind that makes the air cold in a summer town. The next morning, I wanted to leave. I tried calling for a tow from outside town, but the motel phone was just dead static. I asked around, but everyone I approached shut their doors. Even the mechanic told me to wait until after Thursday, not a minute sooner. I started searching for answers. Out behind the old burned mill, its shell like the ribs of a skeleton, I found a historical sign, half buried in grass, telling about an explosion in the 1940s. 24 men dead, their names blurred by time. I recognized the surname from one of the mailboxes by my motel. But what unnerved me was the note at the plaque's base, scrawled in pencil. "Let them be fed. Ring the bell. Remember the lost." By Thursday, silence had settled over town, thicker than the summer heat. I walked toward Main Street as the sun was setting. The light had a bruised purple cast, and everything, every brick, every gutter, every swaying branch, looked sharper, more awake. I was the only one outside. When the bells rang that afternoon, the sound was not just metal. Under the ringing, I heard a low moan, thin at first, swelling until it drowned out everything else. My hearing vibrated. The air stank like old oil and blood. I ducked behind a garbage bin, holding my breath, trying not to make a sound. It was there, the thing that followed behind the ringing. Taller than any man, skeleton thin, its shadow smeared across 4 houses. When it passed, the world tilted for a moment. and I saw faces in the glass of each house. Faces pressed to the panes, but mouths sealed shut. Eyes wide and full of terror. It moved from window to window and stopped where I was hiding. The world went silent again. For a moment, I thought it saw me. A cold rush down my back made me want to run. But it just kept counting. 1 house, 2, 3. It moved on. When the bells finally faded, people poured back into the streets like nothing had happened. The moist, sweet scent of the night air mixed with casserole smoke. Main Street was alive again, laughter and clinking glasses, as if nothing had happened. Early the next morning, the mechanic knocked on my motel door. My car was fixed. He pressed the keys into my shaking hand. "You can leave now." "Don't come back at sunset," he whispered. I drove out as fast as I could. The factory ruins, the silent houses, the dinner bells hanging from every porch. All receded in my rear view as the sky brightened, as the world resumed its normal noises. Even now, sometimes near sunset, if everything suddenly goes quiet, I feel my heart race and I check outside. I wonder how many other towns ring their bells at a secret hour, and what comes walking their empty streets when no one's looking. And I'm always inside before the sun goes down. I thought the humidity was killing me. That's what I told myself during my first week in Catahoula Parish. I was there to study weather patterns for the National Weather Service, documenting anomalous heat readings that didn't match any other bayou region in Louisiana. The instruments showed temperatures 10 degrees cooler than what people experienced. Something about the air itself was wrong, and I was there to figure out why. The locals were polite but distant. They'd offer me sweet tea on their porches and answer my questions with one-word replies. When I asked about the heat, they'd just shrug and say it was always like this in summer. But I noticed things. Small things. The way they'd pause mid-sentence when a breeze shifted. How they'd glance over their shoulders when the air got thick. The way no one stayed outside past dawn during heat waves. I started setting up monitoring equipment around town. Temperature sensors, humidity gauges, barometric pressure readers. The data I collected made no sense. The humidity readings were off the charts, sometimes reaching impossible levels, over 100% saturation. But there was no rain, no fog. Just this oppressive, clinging thickness that made every breath feel like drowning. On my 5th morning there, I woke up before sunrise to check my equipment. That's when I saw them. People standing in their yards, completely still, facing east toward the rising sun. There were maybe 15 of them scattered across the neighborhood, and they weren't moving at all. Not swaying, not shifting weight, just standing there as the first light broke through the trees. I grabbed my camera and started documenting it. Through the lens, I could see something I'd missed with my naked eye. They were dripping, not sweating, dripping. Condensation rolled off their skin in steady streams, pooling at their feet like they were made of glass left out overnight. The puddles around their ankles reflected the dawn light, and the air around each person shimmered with visible moisture. I approached one of them, an older man I'd interviewed 2 days prior. I called his name. He didn't respond. His eyes were open, staring straight ahead. And when I got close enough, I could see his chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm with the humid breaths of wind moving through the trees. He was breathing with the air itself, synchronized, like his lungs weren't his own anymore. The moment the sun fully cleared the horizon, they all moved at once. They blinked, wiped their faces, and walked back inside their homes like nothing had happened. The puddles evaporated within seconds, leaving the grass dry as bone. I tried to ask the man about it later that day. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not fear, not confusion, just a deep, resigned sadness. He told me I should leave before the next heat wave hit. That people like me, people from outside, we don't understand how things work here. He said the air has weight in Catahoula Parish, and sometimes that weight gets too heavy to carry alone. I didn't leave. I couldn't. The scientist in me needed answers, needed to document this, needed to understand what I was seeing. I set up cameras on timers to capture the dawn gatherings. I collected samples of the water that pooled beneath the standing people. I measured everything I could measure. The samples came back as pure water, distilled almost. No minerals, no bacteria, nothing that would indicate it came from a human body. It was condensation, pulled directly from the air itself. But that didn't explain why it was happening, or why it only happened to certain people, or why they all stood there breathing in unison. The heat wave hit on my 10th day. The temperature didn't climb gradually. It slammed down like a weight, and by mid-morning, the air was so thick I could barely see across the street. The humidity gauge on my equipment shattered. The glass just cracked from the inside out, and when I picked up the pieces, they were wet. Soaking wet. Like the moisture had condensed so heavily inside the instrument that it had nowhere else to go. I stayed inside that day, watching through my window as the town became a ghost of itself. No one drove. No one walked. Every door stayed shut, every curtain drawn. The air outside my window moved in ways air shouldn't move, swirling in patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost purposeful. I started to feel it then. The pressure, not on my skin, but inside my lungs, like something was breathing with me, matching my rhythm, learning the pattern of my inhales and exhales. That night, I couldn't sleep. The air in my room felt alive. Every breath I took felt shared, like I was pulling oxygen from something else's lungs, and it was pulling from mine in return. I got up to open a window, thinking fresh air might help. But when I pulled back the curtain, I saw them again. The people. More of them this time, maybe 30 or 40, standing in the street outside my motel. They were facing my window, dripping. The condensation pooled around them in sheets, and the air above their heads shimmered and writhed like something visible, something almost solid. I backed away from the window, heart hammering, and that's when I felt it touch my skin. Not a hand, not anything physical, just the humidity itself, pressing against me like a presence, like it was tasting me, learning me. My arms were suddenly slick with moisture I hadn't produced. My hair dripped. Water ran down my face even though I wasn't crying, wasn't sweating. It was condensing directly onto me, and with each drop I felt something else breathing. Something vast and patient that had been here long before the town was built. Something that lived in the summer air and fed on the heat. I ran to my car, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The air followed me. I could feel it pressing against the windows, seeping through the vents, filling the car with that thick, wet presence. I drove. I didn't stop until I was 50 miles away, and the air started to feel normal again, dry and thin and lifeless in a way that felt like relief. But here's the thing I didn't tell my supervisors when I filed my report. Here's the thing I've been too afraid to say out loud. It's been 3 months since I left Catahoula Parish, and every morning at dawn, I wake up standing. I don't remember getting out of bed. I don't remember walking to the window. But I'm always there, facing east, And when I look down, there's water pooling at my feet. My chest rises and falls in rhythm with something I can't see. Something I brought back with me. Something that learned my breath and won't let go. The humidity isn't just weather. It's not just moisture in the air. In that place, in Catahoula Parish, it's alive. It's present. It's been getting thicker every summer. Not because of climate change or atmospheric patterns, but because it's growing, learning, collecting. And everyone who's ever stood in those yards at dawn, everyone who's ever felt it breathe with their lungs, they're part of it now. They're feeding it. They're keeping it alive. And now, so am I. Every morning, I wake up dripping. Every breath I take feels shared. And I know, deep in the part of me that still understands fear, that one day I'll go back. Not because I want to, but because it's calling me home. Because the air in Catahoula Parish remembers me now. And it's not done with me yet. You ever notice how some churches don't just make you feel guilty? They make you feel watched? I learned that out in a little place in Pickens County, South Carolina. If you drove past it in the daylight, you wouldn't think twice. One white clapboard church, sagging a little on its foundation, a hand-painted sign, a gravel lot, and a shallow red clay pit down the hill they called the baptismal. It looked like 100 other old country churches you pass on winding southern roads, the kind you forget 5 minutes later. I didn't go there for faith. I went there with a camera. Back then, I was working on a low-budget documentary about dying rural congregations. Old churches, shrinking memberships, empty pews. I'd been chasing stories through little southern towns for months, asking the same questions, getting the same soft, tired answers. But when I mentioned the church with the red clay baptismal, people stopped talking. They'd say it was set in its ways, that it wasn't for everybody. Nobody badmouthed it. Nobody praised it either. They just stepped around the subject, like it was a hole in the floor they knew to avoid. I heard about it from an old pastor in town. He said if I wanted something purely Southern, purely old-time, I should drive out past the old mine road and look for the white church over the clay pit. He told me they still baptize people in that pit. No river, no tank, just water poured straight into the earth until it turned into this deep, rust-colored pool. "Why the clay?" I asked. He just shrugged and said, "They say it holds on to what you give it." When I pulled up for the first time, a Sunday morning in June, the air felt heavy. Not hot yet, but thick, like the day was holding its breath. The church sat on a low rise, and that pit, sunken, oval, ringed with wood planks as a makeshift walkway, waited just below it, full of standing water the color of old blood. The clay around it was iron red. If you've ever seen southern dirt after rain, you know the color I mean. But this looked darker, like something had soaked into it that never washed away. The service itself was ordinary. Hymns, a sermon that went on too long, a few kids fidgeting in the back. The preacher was a tall, narrow man with gray at his temples and a voice that stayed low, never quite matching the words. He welcomed visitors, asked if anyone needed saving, all the usual lines. What wasn't usual were the eyes. People watched me, but not in the way small towns usually watch outsiders. It didn't feel curious. It felt measuring. Every time I checked my camera settings, I could feel someone's gaze slide across my face, like they were deciding where I fit. After the sermon, the preacher announced there would be a baptism. He said it with a kind of relief. No thunder, no theatrics, just, "We have another soul ready for the clay." I followed them down to the pit. If you've ever stood beside a body of water that isn't right, you know the sensation. That subtle recoil from the edge, even if it looks calm. The surface was still, but not in a peaceful way. It reminded me of a scab. The congregation gathered in a wide half circle. No one spoke, not even the kids. The only sound was the buzz of cicadas and the faint slosh as the preacher stepped barefoot into the pool. The water came up just above his knees. It clung to his pants in slow, sticky folds. The person being baptized walked down barefoot as well, rolled up jeans, head bowed. I kept my camera on their face, but something else kept catching my eye. The people on the bank, how they all held themselves the same way. Spine straight, knees slightly bent, shoulders just a little forward. When one of them shifted, 3 or 4 others made the same tiny movement, like they were dancers hitting a cue. I told myself it was just shared habit, church body language. But it didn't stop bothering me. The preacher dipped the person into the water. For a moment, their face disappeared beneath the red surface. The congregation leaned in as one, like tall grass catching the same gust of wind. When the head came back up, the person gasped, blinking. And that's when I saw it. The tiniest change. Like something behind their eyes had stepped forward and the original owner had taken a step back. It was the same look I'd seen on every other face there. "Brother, would you like to say something?" the preacher asked. The person turned to the congregation, and the way they smiled, it wasn't the first smile, the one from before. It was an exact copy of the preacher's smile. Same tightness at the corners, same slow pulling back of the lips as if they were remembering which muscles to use. They spoke. The words were fine. Testimony. Gratitude. But the cadence was wrong. It was like listening to someone read a script in a language they'd just learned yesterday. Getting all the words right and none of the rhythm. A couple of sentences were lifted straight from the sermon I'd just heard, as if they'd hit repeat. When the amen died, the congregation relaxed. But they relaxed together, like a single creature exhaling. That was the first time I thought, they're not just a congregation, they're a system. I left that day with great footage and a bad feeling. The more I watched it in editing, the worse it got. I started noticing identical gestures, not just from the new member, but across different people. The same slow tilt of the head, the same blink, just a hair too long. Couples who weren't related scratched their jaw at the same time. 3 men in different pews crossed their arms on the same word during the sermon. The preacher would make a small, almost invisible hand motion, and 3 or 4 seconds later, some echo of that motion would ripple through the crowd. I told myself I was overanalyzing. When you stare at something long enough, your brain finds patterns whether they're really there or not. Still, I couldn't shake it. So I went back. I framed it as follow-up. Additional interviews. Maybe a longer segment on their unique local tradition. I didn't tell anyone I'd been scrubbing through footage at 2 in the morning, freezing on faces that all seemed to settle into the same neutral expression when they thought no one was watching. The second visit, I asked the preacher about the clay pit. He told me it had been dug after a mining accident in 1931. The original mine was just beyond the tree line, long since collapsed. But the earth there had always been thirsty. He said that word with a little smile, like an inside joke. They'd filled the pit with water, prayed over it, and from then on, that was where their baptisms happened. "River's fine for some," he said, "but water that's just passing through doesn't hold much. The clay does. Clay remembers." "Remembers what?" I asked. He looked at me in a way that made my throat go dry. What you ask it to, he said. I started recording interviews with members after service, one by one out under the trees. I'd ask normal questions. How long have you been attending? What does this church mean to you? What do you remember about your baptism? On their own, the answers sounded heartfelt, sincere. But later, at my editing bay, I lined them up side by side and realized something eerie. They were using the same sentences, not just the same ideas, the same order of phrases, the same adjectives. Little things most people put differently came out identical. It felt like coming home. I felt cleaner than I ever had before. I finally stopped being afraid of myself. Different mouths, same script. I checked my audio for splices. Maybe I'd accidentally copied segments. But no, different backgrounds, different planes across the frame. The only constant was the wording. On my third visit, I made a mistake. I stayed late. There'd been a special midweek revival service. Longer than usual, more emotional. People shouting, crying, clapping out of sync. The sun slid lower, and the red clay pit seemed to grow darker as the shadows lengthened. When it was over, I should have packed up with everyone else. Instead, I told the preacher I wanted just a few more static shots of the empty sanctuary. He said I could lock up when I was done. He handed me a key that was too cold for how hot the day was. As he walked out, I noticed he didn't cast much of a shadow on the wooden floor. Just a faint outline, like the idea of a person instead of the full weight. It was quiet in there when the last car pulled away. The kind of quiet where every creak of the old board sounds like someone stepping behind you. I set the camera on a tripod and filmed the pulpit, the pews, the stained windows. Just coverage. B-roll. When I finished, the sky outside had turned the color of watered-down blood. I stepped out onto the front steps into the thick evening air. The parking lot was empty. The clay pit weighted down the hill, its surface dark, almost black. Something about the angle of the setting sun made it look bottomless. I don't even remember deciding to walk down there. I just found myself doing it. Gravel crunching under my shoes, air buzzing with unseen insects, my skin pricking like I'd walked into a field of static. The closer I got, the less it smelled like water. It smelled like metal. Old pennies in hot hands, like the first breath you take walking into a hospital. I stood at the edge and looked down. The surface was still but not flat. It had a contour to it, a subtle shifting, like something just under the surface might be moving slowly. I leaned closer and saw it. Faces. Not clearly, not like you see in a movie. Just the impression of eyes and mouths, blurred like reflections in warped glass. Hundreds of them, layered deep, rising and falling as if breathing. I recoiled so fast I slipped on the muddy bank. My foot slid and I went down on one knee, hand plunging into the red water to catch myself. It was warmer than my skin, almost body temperature. For a second, something wrapped around my wrist. Not like fingers, but like a soft pull from every direction at once, and a rush of, not voices exactly, but impressions, hit me. Terror, relief, surrender, all mixed together and pulled through the same narrow funnel straight into my head. I yanked my hand back so hard I fell onto the dry clay above. My skin from fingertips to elbow was coated in red, a clingy film that didn't drip, just held on. My heart hammered. I couldn't catch my breath. The air felt twice as thick all of a sudden. When I wiped the water off on my jeans, my hand kept tingling. Not numb, too alive. Like every nerve ending had been opened. That night, the dream started. In the first one, I was standing in that pit. The congregation watched from the bank. The water didn't feel like water. It felt like thousands of small, soft things pressing against my legs, rapping gently, as if testing my shape. The preacher put his hand on the back of my head and pushed me under. Down there, I didn't see bright light or memories. I saw rooms, not mine, not the church's, mine mixed with theirs. Kitchens, bedrooms, hospital corridors, motel rooms, all stitched together into some impossible structure. People were in them, mouths moving, but their words were just bubbles rising through thick red fluid. Every dream after that, I stayed under a little longer. I knew I should walk away from the project, ship what footage I had, write some sanitized narration about resilient faith in small-town America, and forget that church existed. Instead, I found myself driving back one more time, telling myself I needed a conclusion for the documentary. The preacher met me on the steps like he'd been expecting me. "You've been carrying something," he said, before I even opened my mouth. The clay sometimes holds too tight when it takes a taste without permission. I opened my mouth to tell him I wasn't interested in joining, that I was just there to film, to observe. But the words that came out weren't the ones I'd planned. "I just want to stop being afraid of myself," I heard myself say. He smiled that slow, familiar smile. "That's what this is for," he said. "We don't wash sins away here. We put them somewhere they can't get loose." He walked me down to the pit as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The congregation had gathered without my noticing. They flanked the path like they'd been waiting for this moment for a long time. Their heads tilted, their blinks synchronized, their bodies already holding that same subtle posture. Standing at the edge, every rational part of me screamed to run. To get in my car, leave the clay, leave the red water, leave these people with their matching voices and borrowed movements. But another part of me, the part with the tingling wrist, the part that had felt those impressions of fear and surrender under the surface, wanted to know what they'd done to make living with themselves easier. The preacher held out his hand. "You've already touched it," he said quietly. "It already knows you. All it's waiting for now is your agreement." "What happens if I say no?" I asked. His eyes didn't change. His voice didn't rise. "Clay keeps what it's given," he said. "It doesn't chase, but it does remember. You walk away now, you'll take that weight with you. You've felt a fraction of it. You know how heavy other people's fear is. Imagine carrying all of your own, alone, for the rest of your life. Some folks can do it. Most can't. The horror of it wasn't claws or fangs or monsters in the water. It was the temptation. The way my mind flinched from my own memories and leaned toward the idea of something else holding them, storing them, digesting them slowly in exchange for what? Relief? Uniformity? Joining an echo that never had to think its own thoughts again. I stepped back. That tiny motion broke something in the air. For the first time since I'd found that church, the congregation stopped moving together. A few looked confused. One woman's mouth trembled like she might cry. The spell, if that's what it was, cracked for just a heartbeat. The preacher's hand stayed outstretched. Then he did something that chilled me more than any sermon or dream. He shrugged. "No shame in it," he said softly. "Not everyone's ready to lay themselves down. Some are called to keep walking around carrying what's theirs. But you'll feel it when it gets too heavy. And when you do, you'll remember this place. Clay's patient." I left. I don't remember the drive back to town. Just the feel of the steering wheel under my still tingling hand and the sound of my own breathing, too loud in the cabin. I shipped the footage. I never finished the documentary. I told my funders the story didn't go anywhere, that the angle wasn't strong enough. I changed my number. I moved states. It's been a few years now. Here's what I didn't expect. Every time something happens that should break me, every betrayal, every mistake that wakes me up at 3 in the morning, I feel a low pull under my skin, like something down there is offering to take it. Like there's a place, miles away in a red clay pit behind a white church, that's still waiting with open arms and warm water. And sometimes, when I catch myself in the mirror too long, I see it. Just a flicker. My head tilting in a way I don't remember deciding. A blink that lasts 1 second too long. A borrowed motion from a congregation I never joined. I didn't go under that water, I know that. But the clay touched me. It tasted my fear. And it remembers. If you ever find a church in the South with a red clay pit out back instead of a river, don't get curious the way I did. Don't lean over the edge. Don't see what's moving just below the surface. You don't have to believe in anything for something like that to believe in you. You ever move somewhere new and feel, right away, that the house knows more about you than it should? That's how it felt the first night in that place in Macon County, Tennessee. Not haunted, not cold, just quietly aware. The realtor handed me the keys and only gave one real instruction, said it like it was nothing. Whatever you do, don't turn off the porch light at night. No explanation. No nervous laugh to show she was kidding. Just that, and then she was gone. Tires spitting gravel as if she couldn't wait to put distance between herself and that house. I thought it was small-town superstition. You know how it is. Everywhere has its quirks. A plastic owl nailed to a fence for luck, a certain chair no one sits in, a road people won't drive after dark. I figured this was just one of those things. The porch already had an old yellow bulb humming above the steps, burning even in daylight. I told myself I'd replace it eventually. I didn't even consider turning it off that first night. I had boxes to unpack, a tired wife, a sleepy kid, and a head full of plans. It was my daughter who noticed the other lights. We stepped out onto the porch around dusk, just to feel the evening air. The heat was slipping away, but the sky still held that pinkish bruise of a southern sunset. She nudged me and pointed down the gravel road. Every single house, as far as we could see, had their porch light on. Not just on, bright. Every bulb, every color, from soft yellow to harsh white, burning in sync like a line of little watchful eyes. No one was sitting out. No rocking chairs moving, no screen doors creaking. Just rows of lit porches and the occasional flicker from a TV inside. The town wasn't dead exactly. It was just sealed. My daughter laughed it off at first. "Guess nobody likes the dark around here," she said, twirling a moth between her fingers before it flew off toward the bulb. The funny thing, there weren't many moths. In a southern summer, I'm used to lights turning into bug magnets, wings, legs, those little thumps of bodies hitting glass. But our porch light, it buzzed, it glowed, and the air around it was almost empty. 1 or 2 pale wings, nothing more. I didn't think much about it until later. You'll find that's a theme in this story, things I should have taken seriously sooner. We settled in. The days were normal. School, work, groceries from a little store off the highway. People were polite, but their eyes kept darting to the sky whenever we talked too long. More than once, someone ended a conversation with, "Y'all got your porch light fixed?" Or, "You know the rule, right?" Always followed by that quiet, careful smile people wear when they're trying not to scare you. A week in, my daughter started keeping a journal. I only know that because she told us she wanted to document the move. She liked words, liked secrets too. I didn't read it then. I wish I had. The first time I almost broke the rule, it was completely innocent. Power bill came in higher than expected, and I walked onto the porch around midnight, half asleep, to flip the switch. The bulb cast that tired yellow halo over the steps, and beyond it, the yard fell into heavy darkness. It looked peaceful. Cool, I thought. This is ridiculous. It's just a light. My hand was already on the switch when I heard it. Not a voice, not a full sound. Just a hush. A quick, sharp inhale from somewhere out in the black, as if the yard itself had seen my fingers move and was bracing for something. The hairs on my arms rose. I stepped back, heart kicking, and left the switch alone. Maybe it was nothing. Imagination. Old wood shifting. But when I went back to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there had been hopeful for a second, like it had leaned forward in the dark. The next morning at breakfast, my daughter asked, out of nowhere, "What happens if we turn the porch light off?" Her mother and I did that quick, guilty look couples do when they're trying not to scare their kids. We hadn't talked about the rule with her, not really. We just followed it. I said, "People around here are just set in their ways. It's like locking your door at night. Makes them feel safer." She stared at me for a long moment, then went back to her cereal without answering. A few days later, I found her sitting on the porch steps at dusk, staring into the patch of yard beyond the light's reach. The line where the glow stopped and the true dark began was sharp, almost unnatural. I sat down beside her and followed her gaze. "Do you see them?" she asked. I swallowed. "See what?" "The shapes." I didn't at first. All I saw were the outlines of our trees, the faint sheen of the ditch water across the road, the suggestion of fence posts. But the longer I looked, the more certain I became that some of those shadows weren't tied to anything. They didn't move with the breeze. They didn't match the curve of the ground. They were just there. Thin, tall, angled slightly toward the house, waiting at the very edge of the light. I told her it was her eyes playing tricks. Mine too. We went inside. I locked the door, turned off the living room lamp, and watched the window for a long time. Those little darker streaks in the dark never quite went away. The diary came into this the night I heard scratching. It was late. Everyone was asleep. I was half watching some pointless show, more noise than anything, when something tapped the front door. Not a knock. That would have been fine. Knocks belong to people. This was a soft, dragging scrape, like something with too many limbs was testing the grain of the wood. It started low, near the bottom of the doorframe. Slow, deliberate strokes. I muted the TV and sat there, breathing too shallowly, listening. The porch light shone through the thin curtains, the familiar glow. Whatever was on the other side stayed out of that beam, or at least out of my sight line. The scratching moved higher. A little rhythm to it now. Up the door, across, down again. When it reached the level of the doorknob, it stopped. For a few seconds, I was sure I'd hear the metal turn. Then it retreated. Soft, slow. A whisper of contact down the steps, across the porch, into the yard. And then, nothing. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, when my daughter left for school, she ran her fingers over the front door and frowned. There were faint marks there, thin, nearly invisible, like something had traced long, curved lines along the wood. That evening, she left her diary on the kitchen table. Accidentally, I think. Or maybe part of her wanted someone else to see. The entry from the night before was short. They're getting braver when the bulb buzzes. One of them tried the door. I don't think they know how the lock works yet. I think the light confuses them. It makes them remember they're not supposed to be here. I felt a cold, sinking dread as I read it. She'd been hearing it too, night after night apparently, without telling us. Kids will do that. Carry their own fear like it's a secret project. The next page was older. They don't like the old bulb. It flickers. They come closer when it does. I saw wings, not like moth wings, bigger. I don't think they remember they used to be people when they get that close. I think that's why the rule matters. I confronted her gently that night. Asked about what she'd written. She didn't deny any of it. Didn't play it off as imagination. She just said, "They talk to me when I'm trying to sleep. Not words, just wanting. They miss the light. They want us to turn it off so we can feel what they feel." "Who?" I asked. "The moths," she said. That word shouldn't have scared me. Moths are harmless, fuzzy, stupid little things. But in that house, in that town, with that rule hanging over us, moths didn't just mean insects anymore. She told me about something she'd found on an old computer in the school library, a cached local forum from years before we moved there. A thread titled, "The Year Without Moths." The posts were glitchy, half broken, but the story came through in pieces. One summer, long before she was born, the moths just stopped coming. Porch lights burned over empty yards. People started having the same dream about standing outside in the dark, looking up at a sky full of wings that weren't there. A few people went missing. The ones who came back were different, quiet, drawn, always staring at the bulbs like they were listening to something inside them. "That's when the rule started," she said. Everyone agreed. Lights stay on, always. You feed the dark, it feeds on you. You feed the light, it keeps them busy. Them. That word again. Too big, too vague. I tested it once. You need to understand that. I'm not telling you this like I was some wise, cautious hero. Curiosity makes fools out of reasonable people. There was a storm rolling in. You could smell the rain in the air, feel the thunder before it spoke. Our power flickered twice. Each time, for a fraction of a second, the porch light went out. Each time. Something outside shifted. It sounded like 100 dry leaves scraping over concrete, dragging closer. When the power leveled out, I stood in the hallway, staring through that thin curtain at the glow on the porch. I was tired of rules, of secretive neighbors, of feeling like I was renting fear from the previous generation. So I did it. I told myself I would count to 3. Flip the switch off. Look, flip it back on. Prove there was nothing there but my imagination and a story that got carried too far. I didn't make it to 3. The instant my fingers brushed the switch, everything went quiet. Not just in the house. Outside, too. The crickets stopped. The far-off dog I'd been half-hearing fell silent. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to brace. There was this horrible, eager awareness pressing at the walls. Not knocking. Not demanding. Just leaning. Waiting for me to do the rest. I left the light on. Life in that town became a kind of truce after that. Daytime was normal. Work, school, grocery runs punctuated by reminders from locals. Storm coming. Check your bulb. Hardware stores got spares half off this week. No one said why. No one had to. Nights were different. Nights, the house felt like a ship floating on a black ocean full of things that bumped the hull just enough to let you know they were there. Some evenings, you'd hear soft impacts against the window panes. Not glass rattling, just a gentle, repeated tap. Look out too long, and you'd see pale shapes hovering just beyond the circle of light. Too large to be moths. Their wings didn't flutter. They folded and unfolded slowly, like hands trying to remember a motion. Every once in a while, some family would get brave or careless. Someone's bulb would burn out without them noticing, or a new renter would think the rule was an old wives' tale. The next day, that house would be different. Not smashed, not bloody. Just emptied out of something vital. People moved slower. Their eyes tracked the porch lights like they were following a conversation no one else could hear. Sometimes, a week later, they'd be gone entirely. Car missing, curtains open, light on. The kind of gone you don't put on posters, because deep down you know they're not lost in the way police can fix. We've left now. Moved away. Different state, different climate. No porch on this place, just a little stoop with a motion sensor. But I still sleep with a plug-in night light in the hall and a lamp near the front door. And some humid nights, when the air gets heavy and the world outside the window turns into one flat, dark shape, I swear I hear them again. That soft, papery rustle, a weightless tapping at the glass. I always get up, no matter how late it is, and check the bulbs. Because here's the part that really stuck with me. On our last night in that Tennessee house, as we loaded the last box into the truck, my daughter stood on the porch and looked up at the light. "You know," she said quietly, "I don't think they were always like that." "Who?" I asked, already knowing. "The ones in the dark," she said. "I think some of them remembered the warmth from when they were human. The feeling of standing under a porch light on a summer night, talking, laughing. I think when the moths vanished, they needed something else to go to. So they followed the last thing they recognized." She flipped the switch off for the first and last time as we stepped off that porch. Nothing rushed out of the yard. The sky didn't crack open. The world didn't end. But as we drove away, every house we passed still had its porch light burning, bright and steady, lined up like a row of tiny lighthouses, holding back a sea of lost things that just wanted, desperately, not to be forgotten in the dark. You know how some smells never really leave you? How you can be standing in a grocery store line or pumping gas, and suddenly you're back in a place you swore you'd never go again. For me, that smell is wet sawdust and old machine oil. Every time it hits me, even faintly, I'm right back inside that dead lumber mill on the edge of Bogalusa, Louisiana, listening to other people's memories splinter inside my head. I went there because of a rumor. Not a ghost story, not at first. I'm a union organizer. My job was to check on communities where mills had closed, to talk to the old workers, see who needed help, who got screwed on their pensions, that sort of thing. Bogalusa had a mill that had shut down years ago. No trucks, no timber coming in, no lights, no payroll. But my contact told me something that didn't fit. "They still go to work," he said. "Every morning. Nobody pays them. And they still go." That stuck in my brain. Empty mills don't hum. When the checks stop, folks stop showing up. That's just how it is. But he was insistent. So I drove out. The main road into town was lined with sagging houses and falling signs, like any other place that had its industry ripped out. The closer I got to the mill, the quieter it got. Not peaceful quiet. The kind where every shoe scuff sounds too loud, like you're walking into a room that's been listening for you. The mill itself was sprawling, a low, long skeleton of metal and wood. Most of the windows were busted. The big front gates hung open, no guard shack in use, no signs telling people to stay out. I figured I'd see maybe a handful of old-timers wandering around, maybe kids sneaking in to smoke. I didn't expect a full parking lot. The cars weren't new. They were the kind that you keep running with duct tape and stubbornness. But the lot wasn't abandoned. Trucks, sedans, all lined up in the same worn spots. When I stepped inside the main building, the first thing that hit me was the smell. Fresh-cut lumber, sharp and green, layered over something older. But there was no fresh lumber anywhere. No logs on the conveyor, no trucks unloading, no stacks of new boards. Just sawdust. Ankle-deep in places, drifting in others like beige snowdrifts. And people. They moved slowly around the machines, some in old work shirts, some in t-shirts, all of them coated in a fine dust that clung to their skin. A man passed by me pushing an empty pallet jack, muscles straining like it was loaded. Another stood at a dead control panel, hand hovering over a switch that was taped in the off position, lips moving as if counting. None of the machines were running. Belts hung slack. Blades were still. But the workers moved as if everything was roaring and clanging around them. It was like watching a play without sound. I cleared my throat, called out a greeting. A few turned their heads and nodded at me like I was clocking in late, then went right back to whatever they were doing. Nobody seemed surprised to see me, but nobody seemed fully present either. Their eyes would slide past me, then lock onto some fixed point in the air, like they were waiting for a cue. Eventually, an older man shuffled over, wiping his hands on already dirty pants. He asked who I was with, and I told him. When I said the word union, something in his posture loosened just a bit. "You hear about the back pay?" he asked. "That's part of it," I said. "But there's no work here anymore. How long have you all been coming in like this?" He squinted, thinking. That's the first time I noticed sawdust in his eyebrows, as if it had been settling there for years. "Since they shut the power off," he said finally. "Couldn't leave it like that. Wouldn't be right." "Leave what?" I asked. He didn't answer. Just jerked his chin toward the deeper part of the mill and told me to follow. We walked past dead machines, under rusted trusses, through sheets of hanging plastic that crackled when we brushed them aside. The further in we went, the more the sawdust coated everything. It lay on the floor in thick blankets, piled on surfaces, clung to the walls. My footsteps left clear prints behind me that filled in slowly as the dust shifted. We stopped at what must have been the heart of the operation, a massive, ancient saw line. The blades were dull now, but they still looked hungry. The control booth above it was a glass box smeared with decades of grime. "That's where most of them died," the man said quietly. "Back when it was all still running, logs jammed, cables snapped, folks slipped. Mill chews up whatever you feed it if you don't keep her fed right." He reached down and scooped up a double handful of sawdust from the floor. I watched it sift through his fingers, soft and fine. He did it with a kind of reverence, like he was handling something sacred. "You ever notice," he said, "how sawdust smells more like the tree than the boards do?" I nodded. It did. Fresh, sharp, alive. "This dust is older than you," he said. Older than me, even. Some of it's from that week, from those men. Nobody swept it out. Nobody hauled it off. They shut off the power, walked us all out, and left it sitting right where it fell. He glanced at me, eyes suddenly hard. You ever think about the last thing in a man's head when a saw takes him? The very last thing they see, feel, regret? You think that just disappears? I didn't answer. He didn't wait. You step wrong in here, he said. You can feel it. He gestured for me to take off my boots. I hesitated, then unlaced them and stepped down onto the sawdust. It was warmer than it should have been. Soft, but not like dirt. More like stepping into something that had been resting and woke up when I put weight on it. Walk a little, he said. See if she wants you to know anything. At first, I thought he was screwing with me. Some local ritual to haze the outsider. I took a few steps, my socks sinking in. The particles climbed up between my toes, clung to my ankles. Then I felt it. It came in like a sudden flash of someone else's dream. I was standing on a catwalk. Not me, but as if I was seeing through someone else's eyes. The air was thicker, hotter. The machines were roaring. A log was coming down the line, crooked, rolling, fighting the track. I felt panic prick along the spine that wasn't mine as a hand reached for a lever that stuck just for a second too long. The log jerked, rolled, and there was a bright, clanging, sickening noise, and I staggered back, out of the memory, out of the borrowed body. My heart was hammering. My hands shook. The taste of metal coated my tongue. You felt it, the man said. Not a question. What was that? I managed. He looked down at the sawdust around my feet. Last thoughts, he said. Don't go anywhere when they're heavy enough. They settle. This place is full of them. That should have been enough to send me running. But I'm stubborn. Or stupid. Maybe both. I spent the next few days coming back, talking to more of the workers, trying to make sense of what I'd stepped into. The pattern was always the same. They didn't talk much about the present. They talked about accidents with perfect clarity, dates, sounds, the exact feel of a hand slipping on a greasy rail. They spoke about lost fingers and crushed ribs like they'd watched it yesterday. When I asked about their lives outside the mill, there were gaps. Whole years they couldn't quite pin down. It was like their personal timelines had eroded everywhere, except the places where someone had died in front of them. On the third day, I got bold enough to climb into the control booth over the main saw. The air up there was stiller, hotter, stale with old smoke and sweat. The panel was dead, gauges frozen, switches rusted in place. But there was a pile of sawdust on the floor in the corner, right where a person's boots would have scuffed it weekdays for decades. I knelt, pressed my hand into it up to the wrist, and waited. The world dropped away. I was sitting in a chair that wasn't there anymore, hands flying over controls, sweat dripping into my eyes. A log jammed on the line. Someone shouted over the din. I saw a kid, barely 20, too close to the chain, too close to the rolling teeth of the feed. I hit the emergency stop, but it didn't catch fast enough. There was a scream I felt in my bones more than heard, and a spray of red across the glass that fogged and streaked in a way I've never forgotten. Then silence. Not in the memory. In me. I came back into my own body with my heart pounding so hard I thought I was going to black out. My hand was still buried in sawdust. It was damp around my fingers. You see it? A voice said behind me. I turned. Another worker stood in the doorway, looking at me with a mixture of pity and something else. Something like envy. We got stories in here nobody asked us about, he said, tapping his temple. But down there? He nodded toward the floor. Down there, they're clear as the day they happened. Don't get fuzzy. Don't get dull. That's why we come back. I realized then it wasn't loyalty or habit dragging these people in every morning. It was gravity. The weight of shared trauma, all of it soaked into the dust under their feet, calling them back to feel something real, even if it hurt. You could sweep it out, I said, throat dry. Clean the place, let it go. He actually smiled at that, just a little. We tried, he said. Right after they shut us down, brought in brooms, shovels, hauled it out by the truckload. Next morning, he kicked at the floor lightly with the heel of his boot. The dust swirled, thick and deep. It was back, he said. I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't. The last time I went, I stayed too long. I walked deeper into the mill, into disused wings where the dust lay undisturbed, thick enough to swallow my ankles. Every step was another life, a fall off a ladder, a hand caught in a belt, a man dropping to his knees, chest tight, while co-workers ran for a phone that was too far away. The memories didn't come in clean, single flashes anymore. They overlapped, layered, a chorus of final moments crowding into my skull. For a few terrible minutes, I couldn't remember my own name, my own reasons for being there. I was just weight on a floor that wanted to pull me all the way under. When I finally staggered out into the sunlight, blinking, lungs burning like I'd been breathing sawdust instead of air, the older man from the first day was waiting by my car. Now you get it, he said softly. I told him they couldn't keep doing this, that this wasn't healthy, wasn't normal. He nodded like he agreed. You gonna shut it down? He asked. Lock the doors? Tear it down, maybe. Turn it into one of those memorial parks with nice, clean plaques? That's not my call, I said. Doesn't matter, he said. You could pave this whole place over, put up a Walmart, build a church. Dust don't care. It remembers. It'll be here under whatever you stack on top of it. He stepped closer then, so close I could smell the mill on him, ground into his pores. You know the part nobody tells you? He asked. It's not just the last thoughts that stick. It's the last feelings. All that fear, all that pain, sure. But also the last bit of love. The last time a man thought about his kids, his wife, his dog waiting on the porch. All of that's in there too. Wrapped up together. You felt it. Tell me you didn't. I couldn't. Because he was right. Underneath the terror and the shock, there had been flickers of warmth, faces, scents, brief flashes of sunlight through truck windows, tiny, stubborn human things refusing to vanish, even in the worst seconds. That's why it's hard to leave, he said. Out there, the days blur. In here, everything's sharp, everything matters. And if we don't walk it, if we don't keep pressing those tracks in, I think it'll forget us, and we'll forget ourselves. I left Bogalusa the next morning, filed my reports, talked about pensions and healthcare and job retraining programs. I never wrote down the part about the sawdust and the memories. How do you phrase that in an email? By the way, the mill floor is a graveyard of thoughts, and they're still fresh. But here's the thing that keeps me up now. Some mornings, I wake up with the smell of fresh-cut pine in my nose. Strong as if someone had run a board through a saw right beside my bed. On bad nights, I jolt awake with my heart racing and a phantom sensation of warm dust between my toes. For a moment, I'm not sure which life I'm in, mine or one of the others I walked through. I haven't been back. I tell myself I won't, that going back would mean letting that place decide who I am. But on the worst days, when the world feels gray and flat and meaningless, I catch myself thinking about that heat, that smell, that rush of someone else's last clear thought. And I understand, in a way that scares me more than anything else, why they keep showing up to a job that doesn't exist. The mill isn't abandoned. It just doesn't need power anymore. It runs on memory. You ever get a feeling from something cheap and innocent, like carnival lights and cotton candy, that there's something underneath it watching you? That's how it started for me, at a little county fair in Blount County, Alabama. You know the kind. Ferris wheel you can see from miles away, gravel lot, rides that look older than half the people operating them. The fair only came through once a year, always in August, always setting up in the same empty field outside town. Folks around there talked about it like a season, not an event. When the fair comes, they'd say, the way you talk about summer storms or hunting time. I wasn't from there. I was just passing through, working seasonal jobs with a traveling outfit, until I realized this fair wasn't like the others. You need to understand. I've worked a lot of midways. Rigged games, fried food, barkers with sore throats, and pockets full of crumpled bills. At first glance, this one looked normal. Tilt-a-whirl, scrambler, ring toss, all the greatest hits, kids running wild, parents trailing behind with sweat-darkened shirts. But right away, something felt off in the air. Not wrong exactly. More like organized. Like every laugh, every shout, every ride squeal was hitting the exact mark it was supposed to. The first night, the boss gathered us in the back lot, under the sagging shadows of unlit rides. He wasn't the owner. I never met whoever really owned this thing. But he was the one who hired me. Stringy hair, sunken eyes, voice that never got louder than it had to. "This stop's special," he said. "These little towns, they remember us. We do right by them. They do right by us. You see a kid winning too much, you let him. And when it's time for fair royalty, don't interfere. That part ain't for us." Nobody asked what that meant. A few of the old hands just nodded like they'd heard it all before. I didn't. But I'd been on the circuit long enough to know when not to push. I figured fair royalty was just some local thing. A kid gets a paper crown, stands on a stage, everybody claps, goes home full of funnel cake. I was wrong. The second night, I started noticing one kid in particular. There always is one. The one every game mysteriously loves. At the ring toss, every throw landed just right. At the balloon darts, every balloon popped on the first try. Over at my stand, knock over the bottles with a softball, this kid threw, and I watched the ball curve midair like something invisible nudged it. The bottles toppled in a perfect little crash. Every time. Other kids got close, sure. Won prizes. But this one didn't miss, and no one complained. Parents smiled, clapped, said things like, "Looks like we got a lucky one this year." The boss watched from a few feet back, hands in his pockets, eyes flat. By the time the sun dipped low and the sky turned that deep southern purple, you could tell everyone knew. This was their fair royalty. They didn't even bother trying to hide it. The kid ate for free, rode for free, every crew member waving them on with an almost relieved expression. When the announcement came over the crackling PA, "It's time to crown this year's fair royalty." Everything on the midway paused. Not shut down, not officially. But rides slowed, games went quiet, conversations stopped mid-word. People turned toward the small stage by the Ferris wheel like they'd been waiting 11 months and 51 weeks for this moment. The kid went up with a stiff, dazed sort of walk. The boss placed a cheap plastic crown on their head. But the way everyone watched, you'd have thought it was gold. You could feel the whole fair adjust, like something had just clicked into place. That should have been the end of it. Photo op, applause, fireworks. But when the show ended and the families trickled back to their cars, the fair royalty didn't leave. I saw them later that night, after closing, sitting alone on the edge of the bumper car platform. No parents, no friends. Just sitting there, swinging their legs while the lights shut off one by one. I went over, told myself I was just checking they hadn't been left behind. "You okay?" I asked. They nodded, but their eyes were distant, too wide, too fixed on the dark curve of the Ferris wheel. "What do you get for being royalty?" I tried to joke. "Extra cotton candy? Free rides for life?" "Not for life," they said softly. Something in my chest went cold. "Who told you that?" I asked. They pointed, not at the boss, not at any crew member. They pointed up, not at the stars either. At the empty air between the top of the Ferris wheel and the dark tree line. A blank patch of sky that, for one vertigo-slick second, felt too deep. "Them," they whispered. I walked them to the gate after that. A woman, too calm, was waiting. She took the kid's hand, thanked me, and said, "We'll be here every night. They know that." I thought she meant the fair staff. I figured it out later. After that stop, curiosity burrowed under my skin. On my next break in the next town, I did some digging. Public records, old newspapers at dusty libraries. The fair, this exact one, had been hitting tiny southern towns on a loop since the 1930s. The rides changed. The names of the operators changed. But every August, some version of it rolled through. And in every town, every few years, there was a kid everyone remembered strangely the same way. So lucky that week. Couldn't miss a shot at the games. Had the best time at the fair, never wanted to leave. Their names were in archived human interest stories. Grainy black and white photos with unfocused eyes and tight smiles. None of them ever really left their hometowns. They grew up, sure, got jobs, had families. But I couldn't find a single one who had moved more than 50 miles from where the fair had crowned them. A few tried, college 3 states away, job in a bigger city. But they dropped out, came back, just didn't feel right anywhere else. They all said versions of the same line in local interviews. That week at the fair was the best I ever felt. Like everything in the world fit just right. The deeper I dug, the more little threads started knotting together. A drought in 32. A series of crop failures. A desperate town that made a pact for prosperity with a traveling show. Half rumor, half smoke. But the timing lined up with the earliest mention of what locals called the royalty tradition. "It's how we pay them back," someone wrote in a decades-old letter I wasn't supposed to see. They keep coming. They keep us from drying up and blowing away. They just ask for one that belongs here each time. One that stays. My stomach twisted when I read that word. Belongs. The longer I stayed with the fair, the more I noticed how it behaved. It never hit cities. Only towns under 2,000. Towns already thinning out. Places clinging to one post office, one school, one diner. Places that couldn't afford another empty house, but had them anyway. And every time, like clockwork, there'd be one kid. One the fair chose. By the third town, I stopped thinking it was random. I started talking to former royalty. It wasn't easy. You can't just call someone up and say, "Hi, remember when a supernatural contract got hung around your neck at age 12? So I came at it sideways, soothed them with nostalgia. What was that week like? You must have felt like you owned the whole Midway. The answers were unnervingly similar, right down to the phrasing. It felt like something had been waiting on me, one said, staring past my shoulder. I never feel quite right until August, another confessed, like there's this hollow space that fills up when the fair's back. One, sitting in a dim living room with the fair's old flyer framed on the wall, smiled in a way that didn't reach their eyes and said, "It's not so bad, being claimed." By who? I asked. They lifted their eyes to the ceiling, to the bare bulb above us, and said, "You'll meet them if you stay on long enough. Most workers don't. That's why they bring in new ones every few years. The ones who stay, well, someone's got to mind the books." It clicked then. The fair wasn't recruiting kids. It was collecting on something. This year I told myself I'd quit after the run. I'd take my pay, disappear, find a job that didn't come with the feeling of something old and hungry riding from town to town under neon lights. That was before the boss called my name over the PA on the last night of the last town. We'd already crowned that year's royalty days before. A kid with an easy laugh and a knack for knocking over milk bottles. I thought the ritual was done, the debt paid. But the boss waved me over, eyes brighter than I'd ever seen. "Midway office," he said. "Owner wants a word." I thought the owner never. "Tonight's special," he cut in. "You've put in your time. They've taken a shine to you. Time you see how the sausage is made." Every part of me wanted to say no. But I walked to that battered office trailer at the far edge of the lot, under strings of lights that hummed just a touch off key. Inside, it was cooler than outside. Too cool. The air smelled like old paper and ozone. The walls were lined with filing cabinets and ledger books, stacked from floor to ceiling. The boss closed the door behind me, and the noise of the fair dropped to a muffled throb. On the metal desk was a thick, leather-bound book, open to a page half filled with names and dates. They spanned decades, column after column of tiny handwriting. In the far corner was a line labeled, "Considerations." My name was halfway down that column, neatly written, followed by the town where I was born, the year I joined the fair, and in smaller letters, a single word, "Available." Something moved in the edge of my vision. Not a person, not clearly. Like heat shimmers, if heat could bend light the wrong way instead of up. It gathered above the ledger, coiling slow and patient, and the air pressure in that little office doubled. I felt it press against my eardrums, against my chest. "Every stop, every year," the boss said quietly behind me. "They balance the scales. Town gets a year of good crops, businesses stay afloat, bad storms skirt around them. Little miracles no one thinks twice about. And we help them remember who they owe. Names go in the book. One gets circled. Sometimes, though." He tapped the page, right where my name sat. "Sometimes someone off the road fits better. No roots, no ties. Freer to keep moving." The presence above the book leaned closer. My thoughts narrowed to a tight, ringing point. Images flashed. Empty houses filled again, cracked roads repaved, diners lit up with laughter instead of quiet resignation. Towns that refused to die, year after year, because something carried their burden with it from place to place. "It's not a bad gig," the boss said. "You don't die." Not exactly. "You just Belong. To the route. To the circuit. To them. Outside, the Ferris wheel creaked. The music warped for a second, then righted itself. I had the panicked thought that if I stepped out right then, I'd see this fair not as a collection of rusty rides and sagging tents, but as something else entirely. A single, sprawling organism coiled over the field, plugged into every family that had ever traded a child's week of joy for another year of survival. I wish I could tell you I slammed the book shut, told them to shove their offer, walked away with my soul intact. But when you've spent your life drifting from town to town, never quite belonging anywhere, the idea of finally fitting into something, even something wrong, hits a sore spot. The presence above the ledger brushed against my thoughts then, not with words, but with a sense of inclusion, of being part of a pattern bigger than myself. All they'd want, it whispered without speaking, was time. My time. My years, stretched thin along back roads and county fields. I stepped back. I'm not from these towns, I said, my voice shaking. They didn't make any deal with me. They don't get to spend me. For a second, the pressure in the room spiked so hard, I thought my skull would crack. Then it eased. The boss let out a breath he'd been holding. Then you'd best be gone when we pull stakes tomorrow, he said, because once your name's in this book, they keep an eye on you, and they don't like to waste entries. I left that night. Didn't wait for morning. I packed a single bag, took my pay in cash, walked away from the glow of the midway until the music faded to nothing. I still see county fair posters sometimes, stapled to telephone poles and taped to gas station doors. Different names, different logos. But the fonts are always just a little old-fashioned, the colors just a little too bright. Sometimes I check the dates. Sometimes they line up with drought years, or factory closures, or floods that somehow stop just short of some tiny dot on the map. I don't go near them. And some nights in August, when the air is thick and you can almost taste the dust of some far-off gravel lot, I dream of a ledger book opening itself on a metal desk, my name still there in careful ink, that single word beside it, available, just waiting for some tired, hungry town to circle it and call the fair back around. You ever read something online that you wish you could unsee? That's how this started for me. In a dim office in Yazoo County, Mississippi, lit by a single buzzing fluorescent light, scrolling through a thread I should have clicked away from. I work in the school district, the kind of job where everything is forms and rosters and substitute schedules. That night, I was supposed to be fixing a data issue in the system. Instead, I was on a late-night forum reading a post titled, "Anyone else have the same creepy substitute teacher? For decades." Normally, I would have laughed and moved on. But the description stopped me cold. Strict but soft-spoken. Wore long sleeves no matter how hot it was. Old-fashioned handwriting, never seemed to age. And this line, "She only ever shows up a few days before a teacher dies." At first I thought, urban legend. A story teachers tell to freak each other out. Then one of the comments mentioned Yazoo County by name. My county, my schools, my subs. I minimized the browser and pulled up the district's substitute database. It was mostly boring. Local retirees, young grads waiting for full-time positions, a handful of people who'd been around forever. I scrolled, eyes half-glazed, until I saw it. Last name I'd seen in the thread. Same spelling, same first initial. I clicked the profile. The hire date field was blank. Not recent, not old. Just empty, like the system couldn't decide when she'd been added. No phone number, no address. Just a note. Prefers elementary schools. Excellent classroom control. Available on short notice. My skin prickled. I searched her name across the system. She was everywhere. Subbing 2 days at one school, then a week at another. Sometimes math, sometimes English, sometimes art. No pattern. At least not one the human eye could see at a glance. I told myself I was being ridiculous. That thread had wormed into my head and I was seeing connections where there weren't any. But once you notice something like that, you can't unnotice it. Every time I printed a weekly sub schedule, my eyes hunted for her name. And then I saw the first coincidence. One Monday, she covered a 5th grade class at one of our older elementaries. Regular teacher was out, sick. 2 weeks later, that teacher died of a sudden aneurysm at home. Tragic, random, everybody said so. I almost believed it until I checked the history. 2 years earlier, that same sub had covered for a 3rd grade teacher at the same school. 2 weeks before that teacher's fatal car accident. I went backward from there. The longer I dug, the less it felt like coincidence. From the late 90s, back through the 80s, into scanned records from the 70s, and then older paper files someone had digitized long before my time. Her name kept surfacing. Different schools, different grades. Always a short stint, never more than a week or two. And again, within days or weeks of her appearance, a permanent teacher from that building died. Heart attacks, wrecks, a house fire. One murdered by her husband, one who walked into the woods and never came back. Not always the one she subbed for. Sometimes someone across the hall, sometimes a coach who shared lunch duty with her. But always in the same building, always right after she'd been there. My hands were shaking so badly at one point, I had to stop and press my palms flat on the desk. The thing that really broke me was the yearbook photos. We keep old yearbooks locked in a cabinet by the front office. I told the secretary I needed them for archival verification. Really, I needed proof my brain was lying to me. I flipped through them one by one. 1973, 1981, 1994, 2006, faculty and staff group photos, smiling adults in bad suits, feathered hair giving way to big collars, giving way to shoulder pads, giving way to everything else. And somewhere, usually on the edge of the frame, there she was. Same posture, same hairstyle, same calm, distant smile. If she aged, it was in increments so small the human eye could pass right over them. My breath hitched. The fluorescent light above me flickered. And for a second her face seemed to jump across decades, perfectly overlaid. It was like looking at a single person printed on different backgrounds. You know that feeling when the world tilts, just a tiny bit, and you realize the rules you thought you were living under might not be the real rules? That's what hit me in that office with those yearbooks open on my knees. I told myself I was wrong, that there were 2 teachers with the same name, that the pictures just looked similar because of the black and white grain. I told myself anything I could think of, but that night I went back to that thread. There were more comments now, people from different states describing her. Some swore they'd seen her decades apart and she looked exactly the same. Others said she always taught them something wrong. History that didn't match the textbook, math that didn't add up but felt right. Science about things that couldn't exist. I went back to our teacher reports, the incident notes they file after subs. Most were mundane. Class behaved. Lesson completed. But every so often there was a line that made my skin crawl. Students unsettled. Sub taught material not in curriculum. Class quiet. Children unusually distracted looking at windows and ceiling. Sub spoke without using notes. Sub refused to use lesson plan. Told children, "You won't need this where you're going." Unsure if joke. I kept reading until my eyes blurred. Then my daughter brought home a story. She goes to one of our elementary schools, a different one from the ones I'd been digging into. At dinner, she said, between bites, "We had a new substitute today. She wrote funny." "Funny how?" I asked. "Like the letters were holding hands," she said. And she told us about a war that never happened. She said some towns just go away and nobody remembers they were there, except the people who take attendance. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. "Did she tell you her name?" I asked as casually as I could. She did. It was the same name. That night I pulled the next week's schedule. There it was, in black and white. The sub was assigned to my daughter's class again on Friday. I checked the news archives. Teacher in that room, healthy, mid-30s, husband, 2 kids. No signs of anything wrong. My hand hovered over the phone for a long time. What was I going to say? "Hey, I think your substitute is some kind of death omen. Maybe call in sick indefinitely." There are no protocols for this, no form you can file. Instead, I did something worse. I went to observe. I told the principal I was doing a routine evaluation of our sub-pool. It wasn't a complete lie. I signed in, clipped on a visitor badge, and walked down that hallway I'd walked 100 times before. My heart pounding like I was sneaking into a crime scene. You ever feel a temperature change the moment you step through a doorway? The air in that classroom felt denser, not cold exactly. More like the room was full of something unseen that parted just enough to let me through. She was at the board, long sleeves, long skirt, hair pulled back. Her handwriting was beautiful, loops and lines that connected in ways you don't see in modern cursive. The kids were quiet, not scared, not bored, just rapt, like they were listening to a story only they could hear. Except it wasn't a story I recognized. She wasn't teaching the lesson plan. I knew because I'd printed the lesson plans myself. Instead of multiplication, she was drawing a diagram on the board. Concentric circles, names of places around the edges, towns I'd never heard of. In the center, she wrote something that made my stomach drop. Removed. When she turned and saw me, her face didn't show surprise. It showed recognition. Not like, "Oh, I've seen you around." More like, "There you are. I've been waiting." "Can I help you?" she asked, voice smooth. I mumbled something about observation. She nodded and gestured to a chair in the back. I sat, trying not to stare. But every movement she made felt precise, measured, like she was keeping time to a rhythm no one else heard. She asked the kids questions, nothing overtly strange. But the content, it was wrong in a quiet way. Little things. "How many people are in this room?" When they answered, she'd say, "Are you sure?" and have them count again. "How do you know you'll all be here tomorrow?" she'd ask. And when they said because they always are, she'd smile in this tiny, sad way and say, "Not always." At one point, she placed her palm flat on the whiteboard, right over that center word, "removed," and the lights flickered. Every kid's pencil stopped mid-scratch for a heartbeat, then resumed in unison. When the class went to recess, I followed her into the hallway. "Have you worked in this district long?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. She gave me a look that felt like it went straight through my skin. "Longer than you," she said. Your file doesn't list a hire date, I said. That's unusual. She smiled a little at that. Dates aren't very important in my line of work, she said. I'm there when I'm needed, that's all. Needed for what? I pushed. She tilted her head, studying me like I was one of her students trying to solve a problem I wasn't ready for. Some buildings are about to lose someone, she said quietly. It helps if there's already a shape there where the absence will be. I didn't understand. Not then. Why here? I asked. Why this class? Why this school? She glanced back at the doorway, at the empty room with its tiny desks and half-finished drawings on the walls. They're on the list, she said simply. Cold washed through me. What list? The ones that go, she said. Her eyes locked on mine. And the ones that stay and remember. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her she wasn't taking anybody from that building, from my daughter's life. But how do you fight something that doesn't even pretend to play by the rules, you know? Friday morning, the teacher she'd subbed for called out. Car trouble, she said. Might be late. We reassigned coverage. I quietly changed the schedule so the sub went to a different room, a different grade, away from my kid. It felt like cheating fate, like stepping off train tracks at the last second. At 10:17 a.m., a ceiling tile gave way in the cafeteria from an old leak no one had fixed. A heavy, waterlogged panel crashed down onto the lunch table where that other class was sitting. We were lucky. Only one adult was in the direct path. Not my daughter's teacher. The sub. She'd switched lunch duties with the other teacher so she could catch up on grading, I heard later. That detail spread like gossip does, thin and fast. Everyone called it a freak accident. Maintenance error, lawsuit waiting to happen. Nobody mentioned the substitute's name, except me. When I pulled the emergency incident report the next day, I expected to see her listed. She wasn't. Her line in the system showed assignment voided. No death, no accident, no file note. It was like she'd never been there at all. But I remember the way the kids talked about that week. They said they'd had a sub for a while, though it was only 2 days. They said she'd told them things they couldn't repeat because they weren't part of the curriculum. They said she'd written on the board with both hands at the same time without looking. And my daughter, who was in a different class entirely that morning, still woke up that night crying that half of the cafeteria had suddenly felt thinner for a few seconds, that there'd been more space between people than there should have been. I don't know what she is. An omen, a placeholder, a shape that steps into a room right before it loses someone, so the universe doesn't have to leave a gap. What I know is this: she's still in our system. Her name still shows up on the sub-roster, ready to be assigned. The computer suggests her automatically when someone calls out last minute. Every time I see that, I override it. I put in a different name. I shuffle schedules, call in favors, do everything I can to keep her away from the rooms where my daughter learns multiplication and spelling and the names of states. It feels like cheating, like bending something that doesn't want to bend. Some nights I lie awake wondering if I just moved the target from one hallway to another. If by saving one room I doomed someone else's. Because if there's one thing I've learned staring at these files, these old yearbooks, these scattered incident reports, it's this: she always gets a classroom. And somewhere, in some school, there's always a day circled on a calendar that nobody knows they're walking toward until a stranger with long sleeves and perfect handwriting walks in and says, "Good morning, class. I'll be here for a little while." You ever hear a voice where there shouldn't be one? For me, it started with a grain elevator out by the tracks in a little town in Arkansas. Most maps don't bother labeling. It was one of those tall concrete towers you see from the highway, windowless, stained, looming over fields like a forgotten monument. I wasn't there for work or anything official. I was just killing time on a road trip, restless, drawn to old places that look like they remember more than they let on. The locals at the gas station told me not to bother going near it. Bad vibes, one of them said, half joking, eyes not joking at all. That was enough to make me go. The elevator was fenced off, but the fence had a gap where somebody had cut it and bent the metal back. Weeds had grown through the links. Nobody had tried very hard to keep people out. The closer I got, the stranger the air felt. Cooler inside that ring of concrete, even though the sun was baking everything else. It was quiet in that way that makes your own breathing sound too loud. Every footstep echoed just a split second too late. Like the sound was coming from somewhere deeper than the concrete around me. Inside, the main chamber was a cavern of dust and shadows. Old grain still clung in the cracks, a faint stale smell like dried husks and mouse droppings. Light slanted in from a few high cracks, catching motes that drifted lazily, like they weren't subject to the same gravity as the rest of us. In one corner, half buried under rotted burlap sacks, I saw them. 3 reel-to-reel tape recorders, dusty but intact. Their reels loaded with brittle brown tape that looked like it should have fallen apart years ago. Curiosity is its own curse. I brushed the dust off the nearest machine, fingers leaving trails on the metal casing, and flipped a switch out of habit. Nothing happened. The thing wasn't plugged in. There was no power out there. But as my hand rested on it, I heard a sound I shouldn't have heard. A soft, tinny hiss, like tape coming to life. I thought my mind was filling in the blanks, auditory pareidolia, or whatever you want to call it. Then a voice crackled out of the darkness, not from the reel-to-reel itself, but from somewhere higher up, echoing down the concrete shaft. "Midnight service," it said. A man's voice, calm, measured, with that particular Southern preacher cadence that can make anything sound both soothing and threatening. "Welcome to those who gather. Welcome to those who are only almost people." The hairs rose on my arms. I stood very still, listening. The voice didn't sound like it was speaking to me. It sounded like it had been speaking to someone else a long time ago, and the words had just gotten trapped in the walls, looping. "You'll notice the pews are empty," the preacher went on, his voice sliding around the curve of the silo, thin and unsettling. "That's because my flock doesn't sit. They stand in the fields and lean against your fences. They come when the grain is high and your backs are turned." Something scuttled in the darkness above me. I told myself it was just rats. Pigeons, something normal. But the rhythm of the steps, if they were steps, didn't match any animal I knew. Slow, measured, as if whatever was up there was listening along with me, waiting for a part of the sermon it liked. I should have left. Instead, I found an old metal folding chair and dragged it under the least broken skylight. I pulled out my phone, switched on the recorder, and just listened. The voice went on, sermon after sermon, stitched together with long stretches of grainy silence. He talked about the empty folk, the ones who showed up only at harvest. Not ghosts, not demons. Something else. Something that wore human shapes like borrowed clothes. "They're learning," he said. "They watch how you bow your heads, how you shuffle in the pews. They listen to when you say amen and when you don't. They're not good at it yet. But they have all the time in the world to practice. I imagined a congregation of scarecrows standing in a dark chapel, heads tilted, trying to mimic the living. The sermons never mentioned a church name or a town or any specific date. But there were clues: corn prices, droughts, references to the railroad schedule. I realized these tapes hadn't been made for the radio at all. This was a man talking to something he didn't dare bring into a real sanctuary. In one recording, his voice shook for the first time. "They came to the door tonight," he said. "Not the people. The ones that are almost. They knocked like they'd learned how, but the rhythm was wrong. They don't understand hesitation yet. They don't understand what it means to wait. They think every doorway should open for them, because the first one did." The sound of his breath filled the grain elevator around me, that soft whistle of someone trying not to cry. I found myself holding my own breath to match his, my chest tight. I asked what they wanted. He said. One of them tilted its head. The skin did it a moment after the skull, like it remembered late. It said, "We want what you give them. We want to be blessed. We want to be full." The tape distorted for a moment, warbling. Then, clearer. I told them that to be full, you have to have something inside first. You have to have a self to save. They didn't understand. Emptiness doesn't know what it's missing. It just wants. Dust drifted down from somewhere overhead, as if something had shifted its weight. A fine sprinkling landed in my hair and on my shoulders. I brushed it off with a shaky hand and tried to convince myself it was just the building settling. The recordings grew more desperate as they went on. The preacher started addressing the empty folk directly. "You can't just walk row by row and take what isn't offered," he warned in one. "You can't just slip into them when they sleep in their chairs after supper. That's not how this works." In the silence that followed, I heard something faint. A wet, shuffling sound, like many bare feet on a concrete floor. It wasn't in the elevator with me, not yet. But it was close, wrapped up in whatever memory had gotten trapped on that tape. "Get out," he suddenly snapped, voice turning sharp. "Get out of here. This is my place. You have the fields. You have the dark. You don't get to have this too." The sound stopped. The recording crackled to silence. I sat there in the dimness, pulse hammering, phone screen glowing faintly in my lap. Through the little microphone icon, my own breathing looked jagged and thin. I don't know how long I stayed. Long enough to hear the last tape click on. "This will be the final service," the preacher said. His voice was hoarse, exhausted. There was a faint echo behind him, a breath that wasn't his, like someone standing too close to the microphone. "They've learned patience. They've learned waiting. They've learned mimicry." He gave a shaky laugh. "They came into church tonight," he said. Not all at once. One sat in the back pew, then another near the front, and so on, until I realized half the congregation wasn't mine. Their mouths moved with the words. Their hands found the right places to fold. But their eyes were still wrong. Too still. Too flat. Like painted on windows. A scraping sound rose in the background of the tape then. A long, slow drag, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. "I told my people not to look at them," he whispered. "Don't look too close. Don't invite them all the way in. But you can't tell folks that and expect them to listen completely. We're curious by nature. That's all it takes. One long look, one wondering thought. and they step across. He drew a shaky breath. Dust rained down a little faster around me, and the air in the grain elevator felt suddenly crowded, though I was still alone. They asked me to preach to them alone, he said, out here, away from the others. Said they liked the sound of my voice. Said they wanted to hear about being full again and again until they understood. There was a pause. Then, very softly, I think they're starting to get it. Not the grace, not the mercy. Just the shape of us. How we sit, how we stand, how we fill up the space we're given. They're practicing, using my words as scaffolding. One day soon, they won't need me anymore. One day soon, they'll walk into town at harvest and nobody will know the difference. The tape hissed. I expected an ending, a prayer, a crackle and click. Instead, I heard something that made my skin crawl. A second voice, higher, thinner, trying on his cadence like a borrowed coat. "Welcome to the midnight service," it said, stumbling just a little over the rhythm. "Welcome to those who gather. Welcome to those who are only almost people." The preacher laughed then, but there was no humor in it. "You've got it all wrong," he said. "But you'll learn. You always do." The reel-to-reel in front of me was still unplugged. The machines were dead. But up above, somewhere in the hollow tubes where grain had once rushed like a river, sound whispered and repeated, like a call bouncing between old wooden pews. I stood up too fast, the chair scraping loud against the floor. The noise echoed up, and for a second I heard it come back wrong. Footsteps instead of metal, a shuffle instead of a scrape. That was when I realized something that should have been obvious. These weren't radio sermons that never aired. They were practice tapes. Not for a man, for something else. Something that needed to learn how to speak like us, sit like us, breathe like us before harvest time. I backed toward the gap in the fence, heart drumming, eyes fixed on the dark mouths of the grain tubes overhead. Just before I slipped out, a faint voice drifted down, barely more than a breath. "Welcome to those who gather," it whispered. Only this time, it used my rhythm, my exact way of breathing the phrase. A perfect mimicry of the way I'd repeated those words under my breath minutes before. I didn't run. Running felt like the kind of thing prey did, and I didn't want to teach it one more move. But I've never gone near a grain silo again. And every autumn, when the fields turn gold and full and the harvesters start rolling, I think about empty pews and almost people. And I wonder how many of them finally figured out the trick of looking just right when they walk into town and sit down beside you in church. You ever picked up a phone you knew wasn't really ringing for you? I'm not talking about your cell. I mean a deadline. A payphone that's been unplugged for years, sitting out by an old service station in Livingston Parish, Louisiana, with weeds growing up through the cracked concrete and the ghost of gas prices still faint on the faded sign. That's where this started for me. Standing in front of a phone that shouldn't have worked, listening to a man who'd already died describe an accident that hadn't happened yet. I worked on cell towers for a while, the kind of job that sends you down back roads to check coverage holes nobody else cares about. One of the engineers flagged a weird data point outside town. Repeated 911 calls bouncing off a tower near an abandoned station. Same location every time. Same duration, more or less. Nobody ever traced a physical number. It was my job to figure out if it was a hardware glitch or some weirder kind of fraud. The place looked exactly like you're picturing it. 2 empty pump islands. Station windows boarded up from the inside. One lonely payphone bolted to a metal post near the road. its plastic hood sun-bleached, almost white. The handset dangled by its cord, swaying a little in the humid breeze. Vines had started claiming the post, curling around the metal like fingers. There was no dial tone when I lifted it, just dead air. Figures, I muttered, more to myself than anything. I was getting ready to take some photos and move on, chalk it up as a reporting error, when my cell buzzed in my pocket. Unknown number, dispatch code. I answered, expecting my supervisor. What I got was a man's voice, thin and ragged, like it was traveling a long way to get to me. Hello? Hello, 911? There's been an accident on Highway 63. I don't know exactly the mile marker. It's near the old service station. Please, my wife and daughter are still in the car, and I can't get them out. The truck came out of nowhere. Please hurry. I froze. The payphone in my hand was still dead. No dial tone, no clicks, nothing. But the coordinates pinging on our system said this call, the one I was now somehow listening in on, was coming from right where I was standing. I didn't speak. I know that sounds strange. You'd think I would have said, "Sir, I'm here," or "This is a technician, not 911." But something about the way his words spilled out, panicked, desperate like they'd been said 1,000 times, made me stay quiet. I wanted to hear the whole script. He gave details, make and model of his car, the way the other driver hadn't hit the brakes, how the sound of metal crunching had been so loud it felt like it fractured his skull. He kept choking on the same lines, like a record skipping. Then there was a gap. I thought the call had dropped. In that silence, I heard something small but unmistakable, the faint looping beep of a heart monitor. Back at the office, when I pulled the logs, the dates didn't make sense. That same call, same transcript, same begging, same hopeless hope, had been hitting 911 dispatch every few months for years, always from that same dead payphone. I asked an old-timer in the department about Highway 63, and he gave me a look like I'd just mentioned a relative who died drunk. "Wreck back in '89, he said. "Whole family wiped out. Nobody's touched that station since." That should have been the end of my involvement. Report filed. Case closed under unexplained interference. But I've never been good at stepping away from things that don't add up. I started going back. Not every night, just often enough. Sometimes the phone stayed silent. Sometimes, if I stood near it right around midnight, my cell would vibrate and the call would root through again. The first few were identical. Same words, same sobs. The man trapped in his own last terror, begging for help that would never come. Then, one night, he said something new. "They're not here yet," he whispered. "The sirens. I keep thinking I hear them, but it's just the wind in the trees. I thought they'd be here by now." I felt my blood run cold. I'd read the accident report by then. There were no sirens. No responders arriving too late. A trucker found them at dawn and radioed it in. Time of death, almost immediate on impact. But in his mind, in the slice of reality that kept looping through that phone, he was still waiting. The calls kept changing after that, in small, unsettling ways. He started describing the sky, first as night, then as something else. "The stars look wrong," he said once. "They're too close, like they're pressing down." Another time, he said, "It's been hours, hasn't it? My watch stopped. I can't feel my legs. I don't think she's breathing anymore." I found myself talking back then, just a whisper on an abandoned lot, not expecting to be heard. "I'm listening," I said once. I hear you. The line crackled, and for the first time, he startled. Who is this? He demanded. Where are the paramedics? I had this sick urge to tell him the truth. To say, you're 36 years too late. And the only person on the other end of this is some idiot with a clipboard and a morbid streak. Instead, I said, help's coming. The lie slid out easier than it should have. He sobbed then. Not the ragged panic I'd heard before. Something heavier. A sound of someone whose hope had gone rotten but didn't know where else to put it. Thank you, he said. Thank you. I'll stay on the line. Weeks passed. The calls stretched longer. Some of them went on for nearly an hour. He talked about other wrecks he could see now, ones that hadn't happened yet in his original timeline. A car nosing into a tree 3 miles up the road. A semi-jackknifing on a wet curve. A pickup sliding through a stop sign. I can see them, he whispered. They're all waiting too. It's like all the waiting got pulled into one place. All the calls that never made it through, every breath held before the impact. It's all here with me. That was when I understood something I didn't have the language to explain. It wasn't just his last moments trapped in that line. It was everyone's. Every 911 "What's your emergency" that ended too soon. Every open line with nothing but static, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was no one left to say it. Each time I stood there with that dead handset under my fingers, more of them pressed in. A woman describing smoke filling a bedroom. A teenager trying to give coordinates from the side of a ravine, voice fading as his phone battery died. A choking, wordless sound that might have been someone trapped underwater or under something heavier. The man from Highway 63 started changing the way he spoke. He wasn't just begging for himself anymore. There's a boy here, he said one night. He keeps asking if his mom is still in the other car. Should I tell him? Do I lie? You lied to me. You said they were coming. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I didn't want you to be alone, I said before I could stop myself. A bitter laugh crackled through the line. Oh, I'm not alone, he said. I'm never alone anymore. They keep showing up. All that waiting you folks never fixed. It comes here, to this wire, to this spot. I started avoiding the station, skipping that exit, pretending my reports were done. But the calls didn't stop. They followed me home in a way I wasn't ready to admit. First, it was my work cell, buzzing with unknown flags that trace back to nowhere. Then the landline at my apartment, caller ID reading out of area at odd hours. When I picked up, all I'd hear was the echo of engines, the rush of air right before a crash. And underneath it all, that same thin voice saying, I'll just stay on the line. I don't want to die alone. The last straw was the call where I heard my own voice. Not an echo. Not a recording I recognized. My voice describing an accident that hadn't happened yet. Yeah, I'm on 63, just past the old station, my double said. I think I blew a tire. I'm off in the ditch now. Hang on. There's a truck coming. It doesn't see me. Oh, God. Oh. The line cut off in a squeal of feedback so high it made my teeth ache. I checked my phone history in a panic. The call had indeed come from my number, a number I was holding in my own hand at that very moment, perfectly intact. That night, sleep was out of the question. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw headlights swelling in the rear view, too bright, too fast. I unplugged every phone in the house, turned my cell off. It didn't matter. At 2:13 a.m., my bedroom filled with the faint, distant sound of a ringing payphone. I knew, with a sick, heavy certainty that it was ringing out by that station, in the weeds, in the dark, calling for someone who could never quite get there in time. I'm careful on Highway 63 now. I slow down before I hit that stretch. I check my tires twice a week. I avoid driving it at night if I can help it. But I know, deep down, it doesn't matter how cautious I am. The call is already in the system. My voice is already there, describing the moment I don't remember yet. And somewhere, on a dead line bolted to a rusted post, all that waiting, his, theirs, mine, is pooling like water in a low place. It's patient. It's practiced. It knows how to stay on the line. You ever look at an old photograph and feel, for just a second, like someone in the background is looking back at you? That feeling has been my life for the last year. I work in a tiny historical society in a parish along the Mississippi River. We're the kind of place people forget exists until they need an old deed or a great-grandparent's obituary. My job is mostly boring, scanning photos, filing church records, labeling boxes that already smell like dust and time. I used to love it, honestly. There's something comforting about proof that people were here before you, that their lives left marks. It made the world feel solid. Then I started noticing the children. It happened while I was digitizing a stack of family photos from the late 60s. Birthday parties, Easter Sundays, fishing trips at the river. All the usual poses. Kids around a cake, kids on a swing set, kids in church clothes squinting into the sun. I was halfway through the stack when something tugged at the back of my mind. A little itch of recognition that didn't make sense. In one picture, a backyard cookout, there was a group of kids in the foreground, and way in the back, near the fence, stood a boy and a girl. They weren't posing. They weren't even part of the cluster. Just standing there, side by side, looking straight at the camera. Nothing unusual about that on its own. I scanned the next photo. Completely different family. Different yard. Different year, written on the back in blue ink. And there they were again. Same boy, same girl, same posture, same clothes. Further away this time, half shadowed under a tree near the edge of the frame. Faces just clear enough to make out. You know that creeping chill that starts at the base of your spine and climbs when your brain finally decides to show you what your eyes have been saying the whole time. That's what hit me as I started pulling more photos. Weddings, school plays, baptisms in muddy river water, funeral gatherings on church steps, decades apart, different families, different photographers. But in picture after picture, at the very edges, there they were. Not always in focus, not always front and center, but always present. Sometimes it was the same boy alone. Sometimes the girl with a shorter haircut. Sometimes 3 or 4 of them together. Kids between maybe 8 and 12. Standing just outside the moment everyone thought they were capturing. I did what any sane person would do. I told myself I was wrong. Kids all look alike at that age, I thought. Fashions come back around. Maybe someone had passed on hand-me-down clothes. I told myself anything that would make it not what it looked like. Then I put the photos side by side on my desk. Same faces, same bone structure, same set of the mouth. The only thing that changed was the quality of the camera and the color fading with time. They never got older. The kids in the foreground grew up, changed haircuts, turned into parents in later albums. The ones in the background never did. I went home that night queasy, telling myself it was just a weird coincidence. Next morning, when I unlocked the archive room, the air felt off. Not cold, exactly. Heavier. like the room knew I was coming back to those prints. I pulled out a different collection, just to test myself. This one was from another town along the river, church photos mostly, donated by an old pastor's widow. First communion, Sunday school, revival meetings under a big white tent. I flipped through, heartbeat accelerating with every page. And there they were again. The same children, always at the fringes, always looking a little too directly at the lens. That's when this stopped being weird and started feeling wrong. I did what historians do when something doesn't add up. I went to the records. I combed through school rosters from the 60s and 70s. Checked the names under the little class photos. Laid them out and tried to match faces. Nothing. I searched church directories, baptismal lists, Sunday school attendance sheets. If those kids had grown up here, they'd be in something. They weren't. I even pulled the microfilm for the local newspaper, looking for a feature or a tragic headline. Beloved siblings lost. Local children missing. I found something, but not what I expected. Buried in an old edition from 1968, the headline read, 23 dead in bus tragedy. A school bus had gone off a washed-out bridge into the river during a storm. Too much rain, not enough attention to infrastructure. Same story as always. The article listed the names of the kids who died and the few who survived. I recognized a handful of surnames that still dotted mailboxes around town. When I read the names of the survivors, I thought, okay, maybe that's it. Maybe these are the kids haunting the photos because someone wanted to remember who made it. But when I pulled the class photo from the year before the accident and zoomed in on the faces, the survivors weren't the ones I'd been seeing. The kids from my photos were in the list of the dead. They'd gone into the river in '68, and yet there they were in 1975, standing on the edge of a wedding reception. In 1983, near the punch bowl at a high school graduation. In 1992, at the very back of a family Christmas shot, all in shadow but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. My hands shook so badly, I almost dropped the film reader. Rationally, I know there are explanations for almost anything if you pull hard enough on the threads. Families reenacting old pictures, costumes, some weird local in-joke I hadn't heard of. But there's nothing rational about recognizing one of them in my own childhood photos. It happened on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays are quiet. The kind of days you count staples and straighten shelves just to feel useful. I was alone in the back room, thumbing through a box of unlabeled family collections a volunteer had dumped there years ago. Halfway through, I noticed the photo paper stock looked familiar. The edges, the way the dates were written on the backs. I realized I was holding one of my family's old albums, unbound, probably donated after my parents downsized and grabbed whatever they could keep. I smiled despite myself. There we were, me with a terrible haircut, my mother's outdated glasses, the sagging porch of the rental house we never quite fixed up. I flipped to a shot of my 10th birthday party. Balloons, store-bought sheet cake, neighborhood kids crowded around. I could name every face at that table. What I couldn't name were the 3 children standing behind me, just inside the border of the frame. They weren't party guests. I know that as surely as I know my own name. They were too clean, too still. Clothes a little out of time, even for that year. 1 boy, 2 girls, all standing in a neat line, hands at their sides, looking straight at the camera with a focus none of us had at that age. One of the girls, the smallest, stood just behind my shoulder. If the photo had been taken an instant sooner or later, she might have been obscured. But there she was, perfectly framed, as if the photographer had shifted the camera just enough to make sure she was in the shot. My stomach turned. A memory rose up unbidden. The feeling, at 10, of being watched in that house. Not by my parents, not by neighbors. The sense, late at night, brushing my teeth, that if I turned around too fast, I'd catch someone just stepping back out of the doorway. I'd always chalked it up to being a nervous kid. I took the photo home with me that night. I shouldn't have, but I did. I sat at my kitchen table with every family picture I could dig out of my own boxes. Christmases, school concerts, river trips. In at least half of them, once I knew where to look, they appeared. In doorways. Reflected faintly in windows. Standing in the background of a shot my mother took of me holding a sparkler on the 4th of July, just beyond the reach of the light. They had been there the whole time. I started sleeping with the hall light on after that. It didn't help much. Knowing something's been with you that long changes the way you move through your own house. I tried to tell myself they weren't malicious. They were kids whose last moments were cold water and panic and a bus filling faster than they could climb. If they'd stuck around, maybe it wasn't to hurt anyone. Maybe it was just inertia or longing. But that didn't explain the pattern I saw when I went back into the archives. Every family they appeared with had some connection, no matter how distant, to that bus route. A cousin on the roster, an uncle who'd been a mechanic for the district, a grandmother who'd made cookies for the PTA fundraiser that bought the bus in the first place. One thin line of involvement was enough. It was like those drowned kids had made up their minds. If they didn't get to grow up, they'd be there for every milestone of the ones who did. Watching, waiting, reminding. I started noticing other things in the photos too once my eye attuned. Little changes over time. Early on, they always stood at the very back, never touching anyone, never overlapping a living person's outline. In more recent pictures, though, a hand would rest just above a shoulder. Not on it, never quite making contact. But close enough that, if you didn't know better, you might assume it was someone else's arm, half cropped out. The last thing that drove me from that job was a set of digital images from a funeral last year. A local family had lost a little boy. Car sickness, a bad swerve, a roadside ditch that filled too fast with rain. They sent us a batch of photos to file. Funeral practices, memorials, all that. I was tagging them when I saw the shot of the casket being carried out of the church. The pallbearers' faces were tight. People lining the aisle held tissues, hands clasped. And behind them, lining the walls, was what I first took for a trick of light. Faint shapes, a little too pale, a little too sharp around the edges. When I zoomed in, my breath caught. The drowned children were there. All of them, not just 3 or 4 anymore. I counted 7, then 8, then lost track. They lined the walls shoulder to shoulder, watching the little white casket pass. Their eyes weren't on the boy. They were on the families behind him, on the siblings clinging to parents' knees, on the cousins and classmates whose pictures I knew would soon join our collection. They weren't waiting for the dead. They were waiting for the living. That night, I took every photo from my own house that showed them and burned them in a metal trash can out back. The flames curled the edges, blackened their faces, turned their outlines to ash. For a few minutes afterward, the yard felt lighter. But when I went back inside and opened my laptop, a notification popped up. New photos available from your cloud backup. It was a suggestion to revisit old memories. Auto-generated collages of my childhood, my life. I clicked one without thinking. There I was at 10, holding a sparkler. There was my mother, laughing, her head thrown back. And there, at the very edge of the frame, just inside the digital crop some algorithm thought was aesthetically pleasing, stood a row of children in clothes 30 years out of date, their eyes fixed on mine through time and glass, and now through pixels. I deleted the folder, emptied the recycle bin. It didn't matter. The next day, my phone's On This Day feature served me a memory. Different shot, same night, same kids. Here's what I've come to believe. Sitting alone with this, in a town that doesn't like to talk about the bridge that washed out in '68. Some hauntings don't care about houses or roads or graveyards. They haunt records, proof, evidence that we were here and that we loved and lost and posed for pictures in our best clothes. Those kids went into the river with everyone looking at them from a distance. A bus full of lives reduced to names in a list. Now they make sure they're in every list, every frame, every archive. Not because they want to be remembered, because they want to be there, patiently, quietly, in the background, when it's your family's turn to stand on church steps or blow out candles or cut a cake. So that when your picture goes into a box or up to the cloud or onto a historian's desk, and someone a few decades from now flips through and feels that little prickle at the back of their neck, they'll know you were never really celebrating alone. Someone else was always standing just behind you, waiting for your name to join theirs.